In our first chapter of the week 13 lecture, we're going to talk about the historical perspectives and the developments in evolutionary ideas. So early on, in ancient Greece, the philosopher Plato considered species of animals or plants as unchanging. However, way after that, in Renaissance Europe, Buffon proposed that animals can actually evolve. He noticed that in similar environments, the populations can be different. He also recognized that there are some species that went extinct. The foundation that Buffon laid in considering evolution as a possibility allowed Hutton to propose that the changes in the Earth environment are gradual. Hutton discovered that geological changes occur over a long time period, which challenged the pre-existing catastrophic event theories. You can see the Hutton depiction of the layers in the Earth core. And basically it's paved the way to the whole idea that the process of change doesn't have to happen in a very short period of time. Later, Lyell developed Hutton's ideas further, and he calculated the extended age of Earth as a time frame for the evolution. You can see the original illustration from the Lyell's work here. This idea that Earth is very old definitely influenced the thinking by Charles Darwin when he was considering the process of evolution and the origin of species. Before Darwin, one of the ideas about the mechanism that was driving the evolution of animals were the ideas of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French scientist who proposed that evolution works through the inheritance of acquired traits, so-called use and disuse. So basically, Lamarck, according to Lamarck, the long necks in giraffes were due to the fact that giraffes had to stretch their necks to reach for the leaves. Obviously, this idea was wrong, but the whole concept that Lamarck explored, that species can change, it really helped to foster the evolutionary thought among Darwin and Wallace. So these two British gentlemen independently came up with the concept of evolution by natural selection. So both of them traveled extensively and experienced a lot of interesting and were exposed to a lot of interesting biological phenomena. For example, Darwin traveled on a ship named Beagle, and that's when he visited Galapagos Islands, which becomes extremely important in the developing of evolutionary ideas for him. Wallace took an expedition to the Amazon rainforests and Malay Archipelago, and during these trips, both men observed that there are differences in similar species on the islands. They basically observed the unique adaptations that species showed from island to island. So for Darwin, it was the finches. Finches in Galapagos Islands had different beak shapes. And these beak shapes were defined basically by the food sources that these finches used. So that that allowed Darwin to come up with an idea of the natural selection or survival of the fittest. Darwin proposed that individual organisms with advantageous traits reproduce more and therefore pass those traits down to the next generations. Another example that Darwin observed were Galapagos tortoises. So the longer the neck of a tortoise, the greater the chances of it surviving through the drought, which eventually led to the predominance of the long neck trait among those tortoises. So the principles of natural selection formulated by Darwin were as follows. First of all, traits must be heritable. They should be passed from the parent to the offspring. Second is reproductive success or overproduction. So more offspring is produced than there are resources, and that large amount creates the competition for resources, which leads to the essentially survival of the fittest. Third condition is that the variation should be present in the population. In other words, offspring must be different. And some of those variations should be more advantageous for survival and therefore for reproductive success. Lastly, the descent with modification. Darwin proposed that the traits that benefit survival and benefit reproduction, they become more common through generations in the population. The commonality of these traits results in adaptation of the population to the environment, and right now it is the only known mechanism for adaptive evolution, the descent with modification. In 1958, both Darwin and Wallace present their findings at the meeting of the Linnean Society, and in 1859 Darwin publishes his famous On the Origin of Species, in which he conveys his findings to the public. Now, of course, this theory was challenged multiple times through its existence. It was modified multiple times. But in 1976, biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant were conducting the observations of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So during the El Nino, when the seeds were abundant, finches with the small bills survived better. But in the subsequent generations, the bill size was decreasing even more because of the abundance of the small seeds. However, when larger seeds returned, the trend of having smaller bills, the trend of feeding only on the advantage of feeding on the small seeds decreased, and bills became bigger and bigger. Now, as we mentioned, the evolution requires variation. This variation must be due to the genes in order for it to be able to affect future generations of animals. Non-genetic causes, for instance, nutrition, do not impact evolution. The primary source for the variation in new alleles are mutations. These mutations may reduce fitness, may increase fitness, or may have no effect on it. Another important source of variation is sexual reproduction, because it creates the combination of alleles that are essentially unique. This unique combination of the alleles results in a great diversity of genotypes and therefore phenotypes. Now, in the context of evolution, the term adaptation means a trait that is heritable and that improves survival and therefore reproductive success. For example, the webbed feet in the platypi, the thick fur in snow leopard that has to survive through the very, very cold winters, or the speed of a cheetah that allows it to hunt for food. Now, the trait itself, or a trait itself, cannot be favorable or not favorable. Its favorability depends on the environment. The thick fur of the snow leopard is beneficial for that animal in the conditions where it lives, but if we would transport that leopard to Africa, the situation will be completely different. Now, for example, large leaves is a disadvantage in the dry conditions. So plants that survive in dry conditions favor small leaves. Now, these differences in environmental conditions that drive the favorability of a particular trait are often referred to as selective pressure. The selective pressure may lead to two main types of evolution, divergent and convergent. During divergent evolution, species evolve in different directions from the common ancestor. For example, plants, the flowering plants, have different reproductive structures because they may use different pollinators. Some of them may use insects, such as bees. Some of them may use birds, such as colibris. Convergent evolution, on the other hand, is the evolution of similar traits because of the similar selective pressures. So, for instance, wings in bats and insects are not related to each other in terms of, like, they don't share the common ancestor with the wings, but selective pressure, the ability to fly, the favorability of that trait resulted in independent evolution of wings in insects, bats, or birds. Lastly, what we need to acknowledge is that natural selection, while it impacts the individuals within the generation, so it can impact, and it does impact, every individual organism. Despite of that, the evolution of species takes thousands of years. Nothing can evolve over 1 or 2 generations. Now, what is the evidence for evolution? Well, first of all, it's the fossil record. So, for instance, it shows that organisms that lived many years ago differ from the modern organisms, and moreover, you can trace the evolutionary changes over time. So, for instance, if you look at the evolution of humans here, the hominid fossils, or evolution of horses, you can see how the shape of the skull or skeletal features changed over time, becoming closer and closer until they ended up being what humans and horses look like now. Another evidence is similarities in organ morphology. For instance, the flippers, the whales, skeletally resemble the limbs of birds and mammals. You can see on this illustration, this is the human arm, this is the dog's leg, this is the bird's wing, and this is a whale flipper. They all share the same structures. You can see there is one bone in the upper arm, 2 bones in the lower arm, then you have carpal bones, metacarpal bones, and phalanges. Now, these structures that evolved from the same ancestor, but during evolution diverged and produced different macroscopic traits, such as leg, arm, wing, or flipper, called homologous structures. So, these limb bones is an example of a homologous structure and suggests the shared ancestry. Another evidence of evolution is vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are non-functional. So, for instance, Flightless birds, such as ostriches or emus, still have wings. They don't use them, but at some point, their predecessors probably did. Or the leg bones, the hind leg bones in whales. They don't play any function, but they're still present. They're not obvious. And finally, analogous structures is another evidence. So similar functions, but different origins. As we mentioned, wings in insects and birds, it proves the idea that similar structures similar adaptations will develop under the similar selective pressure. So this is what we call a convergent evolution. For instance, white coat in the Arctic fox and white coat in the Arctic pigeon all developed because of the similar selective pressure, snow. Another evidence is the early embryonic development. If you look at this chart or image here, you can see that the initial stages of development in different organisms, from fish to amphibians to humans, they actually, during the development, they share a trait. For instance, during the development, they have tails, they have gill slits, but last time I checked, humans don't have either. So this similarity of early embryonic development again highlights that they all have the common ancestor. Now, the distribution of living organisms aligns with the continental shifts. It's not a geology class, so I don't have time to talk about this, but essentially the current continents, such as North America, South America, Australia, Africa, they emerged not immediately when the Earth was formed. The original supercontinent Pangaea broke up into pieces that eventually migrated into their current position. And that breakup led to the unique flora and fauna in different regions. If you start thinking about this, it makes perfect sense. The fauna of South America is different from the fauna of Australia or Africa or North America or Asia or Europe, because the breakup of Pangaea erected the barriers between the continents and basically sealed the evolution within the boundaries of each individual continent. So this isolation results in evolutionary divergence. For instance, Australia is famous for its marsupial populations. The only marsupials that are found not on the Australian continent are some opossums in South America. But other than that, this isolation, geographical isolation of Australia, resulted in the independent evolution of animals on its territory. Evolution of Galapagos finches that are completely isolated from the mainland supports that idea. And finally, the molecular structures of proteins and the sequence of DNA also support the idea that we all share the ancestor. For instance, the similarity of DNA sequences in the genomes of different organisms correlate with the evolutionary relationships. Here you can see the amino acid sequence for histone H1 protein in 3 different species of mammals: humans, chimpanzees, mice, rats, and cows. And you can see that there's a great deal of similarity between them. Now, the duplication of genes is another mechanism to evolve new protein functions, resulting in adaptation and diversification. There are a lot of misconceptions related to evolution, and we're going to try to dissuade them. First of all, a lot of people say that evolution is just a theory, Well, the scientific term theory refers to a thoroughly tested explanation and definitely not a guess, as we discussed in the very first week of our class. Just like theories of gravity or relativity, evolution is supported by a large amount of evidence, of data. And if you think that evolution is just a theory, then gravity is just a theory as well, and you can try to fly out of the window. Another common misconception is that individuals evolve. Individuals do not evolve. Evolution works on the populations. And evolution works, as we mentioned, over the time span of generations. So, if you think about the evolution, individual traits, the traits that pertain to every individual organism, they are constant through life. If you have blue eyes, you're going to have blue eyes for the rest of your life, for the most part. If you are very tall, you're not going to become shorter and vice versa. But the frequency of traits in the population changes between the generations. Another common misconception is that evolution explains the origin of life. It does not. It simply describes how species change over time, but it does not address the origin of life itself. The problem with the question about the origin of life is that science works with repeated events. Life, as far as we can guess, originated once, and we were not around. So we don't see that event anymore, and we can't really say anything scientific that would not be a well-educated guess or speculation about the origin of life. Another very common idea is that evolution has a purpose. No. Populations evolve because of the selection, because of the selective pressures. Populations do not have an intention to become taller, to become darker, to develop wings or whatever. Simply, there is a variation within the population, and environmental pressure selects for the traits that are already present and beneficial. It's not goal-oriented. Species do not have to become more complex or better. They just have to have greater reproductive success. So the beneficial adaptations match the environments that organisms exist in. If today there's a benefit to be 10 feet tall, and tomorrow there's a benefit to be 5 feet tall, organisms that were 10 feet tall will have less reproductive success tomorrow and will die out. So, changes in the environment may reverse the fitness of a particular phenotype. For instance, antibiotic resistance in a bacteria. So genes for antibiotic resistance already exist. They don't provide any benefit in the absence of antibiotics, but when antibiotics are present in the environment under the selective pressure, these genes increase in frequency and the bacteria become more and more antibiotic resistant. In our next chapter, we're going to talk about speciation.